Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time around we are going to be adding to the AI Behaviours package, and in particular we're going to be expanding and improving the gameplay debugger. So previously the gameplay debugger was only available sort of as a UI overlay in-game. That's obviously something that, while that works and that might be appropriate in some scenarios, there are other cases, in particular if you've got the editor running, where it could be great if you can have that as a standalone window. So previously I'd done a bit of refactoring to make this sort of supported, or at least to make it easier to support it, but this time around I want to focus on getting the actual window up and running. Do also want to shout out for the suggestion for this, and also for sharing their own implementation of this quite a while back to SiliconOrchid, who proposed this and shared their code for it, which was really awesome. So we're going to be getting this set up now. So in terms of what we want to do with this, we already previously I'd done some reorganization of the gameplay debugger to split out, so there is the core of it that keeps track of what the actual debug content is, and then the presentation side, the UI, is completely separate and it can support multiple active UIs. So what we want to focus on this time around is getting our actual sort of screen set up. So because this is going to be editor only, I'm going to create a folder here, editor. So it's an important thing. It's very easy to forget with stuff with Unity, that you want to, if something is accessing editor only things, to have that in a folder with the exact name editor, because otherwise if you have editor code sitting outside of that, when you go to do a build, it will actually get grumpy at you. So just something to always watch for. So this is going to be our game debugger, and this is our editor window. Now for setting this up, I'm going to be doing this using the UI element system. So that's going to be a big sort of part of what I do with this. Now, a couple of things that I want to add to the interfaces to make this work a little bit differently. So the existing gameplay debugger doesn't need to know about a list of sources. It's essentially driven by selecting things in the UI, stuff like that. What I want to be able to do for this, though, is I want to actually make it so that there's a bit more control over what sources you're accessing, stuff like that. So to do that, firstly I'm going to modify the game debugger interface. So I'm going to give it the ability to be able to tell us how many sources we actually have, because that's going to make things a lot easier. I also want to, oops, no, not listen to entry. Sometimes the autocomplete really has a mind of its own, and the problem is it then goes and adds in entries that you don't want. So we're going to have string, and this is going to be our source names. Again, this is something where I could do this just by directly accessing the list of sources, but I want to maintain this. It's a small cost to maintain this list of names, and it also then makes a bunch of things a lot quicker and easier to work with. So that's good. On our source count, our source names, I'm going to also have here, I want to be able to select a source by index. So with the in-game UI, there's not really space there for being able to just have a full list of the sources and select them. But for something like this, where we're doing an editor window, we actually do have the scale and scope to do that. So that's good. That will necessitate some updates for the game debugger itself, which we'll get to momentarily. I also want to expand the options here for the UI. So one of the things I'm going to do is this request refresh. The purpose in terms of sort of where this gets run, if we take a look at the sort of context for it. It gets run when we have gone and modified the list of sources. So I'm actually going to rename this. So we're going to rename that to on source list modified. And then we'll add in an additional one for on debug output updated, so that it can actually notify things when those changes have happened. So that'll make things a little bit neater and easier, just in terms of sort of R structure for things. What that will mean is with our actual sort of UI here, there will be that additional one, but we don't actually need to do anything with it. So I'm just going to leave it there. So that's good. So, okay. The game debugger itself, though, it has modifications that we need to make, because we need to support things like our source count, stuff like that. So what I need to have, and I'm going to just manually add it in rather than auto-completing the interface. Reason being is that the autocomplete for the interface puts things in an alphabetical order, which is often not what you want. And I haven't found a way yet to override that. So we need our source count one. Well, firstly, if sources is not equal to null, then it's just sources.count. Otherwise, it's 0. Straightforward. Then I want to have a public list of strings, and this is our source names, and that's our get and our protected set, and I will new that from the beginning. So that's good. So far so good. Now, when we are going through here and we are updating our debug text, so we've gone through, gathered the debug data, we have checked in terms of the rebuilding the string. What I would do then is, okay, for each linked UI in linked UIs, and we'll just do a double check that it's not null. So if linked UI is not null, then we'll tell it to update. Now, we should be making sure that we are purging any of the nulls, but just in case, we'll do that safety check. So update any linked UIs. Actually, notify any linked UIs of the update. So that's good so far. We've got our select previous and next, but we need our public void, and this is our select source by index. That takes in our index. So we're just making sure this all works. So if our source count is 0, then we do just exit out. There's nothing we can actually do. Otherwise, our current source index, well, I'm going to do a clamp because we want to make sure it can't set a value that's not within range. So that's our current source index. So we're going to clamp in index, and we're going to clamp it between 0 and our source count -1. So that ensures when we are selecting a source that it is going to be properly valid. So, okay, so far so good. Couple of other things that we do need to actually do. So our register UI, just because if we're running and starting stopping a lot, if exceptions, things like of that happen, it is possible that our linked UIs could end up getting a bit stale and could end up with nulls. So I'm going to do a remove all, and then this is going to be in linked UI and we remove ones where it is null. So just whenever we register, we'll remove any nulls like that. Just keeps it cleaner and tidier, which will be good. Now when we're working with the sources, well, we want to maintain our source names. So our source names, we will add in object and our debug display name. The reason for keeping this as a separate list is just saving us having to do, it's a small memory cost, but it saves us having to do that extra sort of lookup and things like that. We can just have a simple list of strings to work with. Makes things a lot easier. I'm going to rename this refresh linked UIs. So that's going to get renamed to on source list modified. So using that rename option is really handy because it goes through and updates it anywhere that it's used, which is always good. Now, with this, we can't do the removal the way we used to do. So what I would do is index is sources, and we find that particular index, then f that index is greater than or equal to 0. Then what we can do is sources, and we remove at that index, and we also do the same with our source names. So that's good. We're just renaming everything and updating stuff. So that's all the changes that we need for the game debugger. And that's no longer grumpy at us in terms of the interface. So, okay. Now what we can actually focus on is getting the things set up in terms of our actual editor window itself. So if we go over to the editor window, so as I said, this is one where we're going to be making use of UI elements side of things. So I'm going to bring in Unity Editor to start with. I'm also going to bring in Unity Engine and UI elements namespaces. So that's good. So a bunch of things that we need to do here. Firstly, this needs to implement editor window. So it inherits from editor window, but it also has to have iGameDebugger UI. Now that's going to necessitate a bunch of interfaces that we have to support. But there's a couple of bits of sort of housekeeping things we need to set up for the actual editor side of stuff as well. So one of those things is, because of how the editor windows work, if we select a particular source, because what we want is a list of sources and then the info. So if I select a source, I want to have it that it remembers that. So I'm going to keep track of here selected source index, and I'm going to default that to -1. Now this serialized field is intentional, and even though this is an editor window, that's actually intentional with it being serialized field so that Unity knows to retain this information. That's how we actually allow it to retain it between opening and closing the editor window. So serialized field, super important there, even though this isn't something we're attaching to anything in the world, even though it's not something there as being even on an asset. So just an important aspect with that. So then in terms of what we're going to have for our UI, we want to retain a bunch of that here. So we're going to have a list view, and this is our sources list. So we're keeping that as a separate variable because that is a thing we're going to be needing to work with in multiple locations. We just want a generic visual element for our source info. And then we actually want to retain a link to our debugger. So that's good. Now we set up the menu item to actually be able to show this window. So we're going to have a menu item. We're going to put this under Tools, AI, and then Game Debugger. So this is a public static, and we call this Show Game Debugger. So then what this does is, okay, well, we have editor window, and window is a new, and what we do is we do get window, and we give it, sorry, we don't do the new, we just do get window. That handles the actual construction and everything if it needs to. We do game debugger, editor window like that. So that's going to create it. And then we just want to actually update the title of it to make sure it's what we want it to be. So that's going to be a new GUI content. And this is just our game debugger. So, okay, that will get the window able to be shown. Now the big thing we need to do is actually create the UI for it. So what we do there is, because we're working with the UI elements, the function we want is create GUI. So there's a couple of things that we need to create. One of the things is we want our main UI view. Now, one of the nice things with UI elements is it actually just by default has a option for that sort of split view with two panels. So our main debugger view, that is a new two-pane split view. So I give it our index, that's going to always be 0 in our case. We want default width, about 200 felt right when I was doing testing for this. And orientation-wise, in this case, the panels are oriented horizontally. So you can do a split horizontal, which means they're side by side, or you could do a vertical split, which means they'd be one above the other. So that's good. We've got our debugger view created, and we add that to our root visual element. So that sets up our main view. So we set up the main view and link it. Now we get to setting up things like the actual source list and stuff like that. So we set up our source list. So what this is our sources list is, unsurprisingly, a list view. We go and we immediately add that into our main debugger view, because that's sort of essential to get that linked up properly to start with. Then what we're going to do is we need our pane for the actual display of the information, and that is just going to be a new scroll view, because that information could be quite lengthy. We want to make sure we can easily scroll through that. The list view is already going to be scrollable, so we don't need to do anything specific for it. This is for that specific source information, because when we're outputting things like the blackboard, the behaviors, all of that, it gets quite lengthy. So this is a vertical one. We could set it to supporting both if we need to, but vertical's probably the main one that we need. But in terms of sort of options here, we can easily select either. So really doesn't matter, it handles that for us. So might as well just go for vertical and horizontal in case we output anything really, really lengthy. That's good. So then we add that into the main debugger view. Source info, and autocomplete has been doing its best to try and add in bugs for me. And that's very not friendly of it. So, okay, that's setting up those UIs for it. So now I need to do a bunch of stuff once I've got access to the game debugger. but I can bring up this window at any point in time. So this is where our service locator comes in really handy. We do our async locate service of iGame debugger. And then what we have is our iLocatable service in debugger. And then we link that over like this. So all of our logic for actually setting things up, we do that once it's actually located the debugger. We don't do any of the rest of the stuff immediately at this point, just because there can be that delay. So what I would do is, okay, well, link debugger is our debugger as a game debugger like that. We register this UI. That way then it goes into the set of stuff for the linked UIs. So we link to the sources. So this is where what we're doing is we're binding that sources list to the necessary list of sources on the game debugger and having it construct the UI for it. So this is kind of, with UI elements, you can explicitly be adding the entries, but also you can tell it, cool, here's the list, and here's how to actually make a UI item for each entry in the list based upon this other list of data. So what I'm going to do is sources list, and I say make item. And what it does is that's a little function that just is going to create a new label like that. Then when it binds those items that it's made, the bind item method, well, that gets our item in and it gets an index. So then what that does is that links over. So we have in item as label. So that needs to match what we're actually making here. So if you modify this, then you would need to modify the matching section. So, okay, we can set its text. So that is our linked debugger and our source names at that particular index. So that would be at in index, like that. So that's good. So that will link up and set the text for the item. Then our sources list, we just need to associate it with the actual particular set of names. So sources list, our items source is equal to our link debugger source names, like that. So that's good. Now we could make this work just with the direct list of sources, but I do prefer just having that clean list of strings. I might go and refactor that at a later point if I find there's a need to, but I can see a lot of uses where I might want to just have a standalone list of strings to just quickly go through that and not have to traverse other stuff. And it's a pretty minimal memory cost for something that makes the access a little bit cleaner, though there is a little bit more maintenance that has to happen there. So, okay, so far so good. We need to know when we've selected a thing in the sources list. So there is a selected indices changed, which we're going to hook up to a function on selected indices changed, which we don't have that function yet, but we will set that up momentarily. Just put a placeholder for it for now. What that looks like is that takes in a I enumerable, and it's an I enumerable of int, and this is our selected indices, like that. So that's good. So we have a notification for when we've changed ones. Then what I want to do is sources list, the selected index is our selected source index. So that's how we do that restoring of things in part. That's good. We've linked over our selected source. And then I'm just going to kick off a refresh of the UI. At this point, we don't have that method yet, but we will get that method set up momentarily. So, okay, let's handle the changing of the selected indices. So first thing I want to do here is I turn that an I enumerable. I need to get the enumerator to be able to get the first item because I only care about the first entry. So our enumerator is our selected indices. We get enumerator. Then what I would do is F enumerator move next. That'll allow me to retrieve the first entry. Then I would say selected source index is the current. Otherwise, selected source index is -1. So that's good. That allows us to, at this point, we know our selected source index is going to be reliable. Our link debugger, we can tell it select source, whoops, not select previous source, select source by index. And that's our selected source index. So that's good. And then what we would do is, again, another call to refresh our UI. This is probably one where, again, for safety, I should make sure that the link debugger is valid, just in case stuff gets selected outside of that. Shouldn't generally happen, but we do want to sort of allow for it just in case. Then I'm going to hook into those methods. So our on source list modified. One of the ones we needed. This is the ones coming from our game debugger sort of ones here. So that's our on source list modified. So with this, all we do is, okay, our sources list, well, refresh the items. So it needs to be sort of manually told to do that. And then, unsurprisingly, we kick off a refresh of the UI. Then we also have public void, and this was our one for the debug info being updated. So this is our on debug output updated. So, okay, when we update the debug output, that also should refresh the UI like that. And then finally, we can implement our function for refreshing the UI. So that doesn't need to be public, but we have our refresh UI function. And in terms of what it needs to do, what we do is we say, okay, source info gets cleared, and then F, we have our valid link debugger, then source info, we're going to add a new label, and we get linked debugger, and we get the debug text for current source. So that looks good. So let's test this out. We just want to see, make sure that this actually works in a simple scene like of this. So firstly, what I'm going to do is bring up the window. And initially, that's what we'd expect, nothing appearing there. Then we go to run this. We've got two ones appearing here. We should notice that the information is changing, which it is. So that's good. And what we should find is, okay, I select B, and it does also update here. So these two are different ones, and they are staying in sync. And if I change this, that goes and updates which thing is actually selected. So that's good. So, okay. And if I select these after stopping, that also behaves completely fine. I can scroll as I need to. So that's good. But what about a scenario where they're being, spawned in dynamically, something like of that, or they're being destroyed? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, in terms of our test scenes, going to go to the village one here, and I'm going to actually modify our village, because at the moment it spawns everything right at the start. So what I want to actually do is I'm going to change this to serialize field float min spawn interval. Be 1 second, and have a max spawn interval, and I might make that 3 seconds. Don't want it to be too sort of long. Then I'm going to have float time till next spawn, and that's going to be -1. And what I'm also going to do is keep track of, because what we previously did is we'd spawned them all in one go. Oops. So we'd spawn them all in one go, and we'd remove sort of the spawn points we used. That is something now where, okay, we need to keep track of that externally, but also it's a thing where we actually want to support having more, to spawn than we have spawn points. We want to be able to recycle ones if we haven't used them for a bit. So I'm going to do that. Don't need to explicitly set it to null, but I will keep track also of the num spawned, which that I will be very clear that that's starting at 0. So, okay, that's good. So what I want to do here is our time till next spawn is a random range like that, and working spawn points. So we're just doing a little bit of renaming of things here as well. Rename those because I already renamed the variable, so that's fine. So I'm just renaming this to be consistent with my style for everything else. Just makes it so that more of the code is starting to look exactly the same, which is good. So, okay, so far so good. This, we can't rely on index anymore. What we would actually do is this whole bit of logic here is going to need to be moved. So what I'm going to do is take all of this, and we'll have our void update like that. So, okay, if our num spawned is less than the initial population, then, well, firstly, we need to know if we actually can spawn. So that's the sort of the first thing that we need to do there. So what I would say is, okay, time till next spawn, we minus equals time.delta time. If the time till next spawn is less than or equal to 0, now we can actually, firstly, we'll reset that timer. So random range. So that's good. Oops, random range dot range. There we go. Now in terms of the actual spawning logic, well, we don't have things inside that anymore. Have is like that. So, okay, so far so good. We get rid of that using of system because that messes up our random calls. So our name, we'll need to update how we generate that in a moment, but our working spawn points here. So if working spawn points is null, or if working spawn points count is 0, then we need to actually reinitialize it. Then we pick a spawn point, can remove it from that list, because we have definitely, at this point we know we're going to spawn 1. can increment num spawned, which means down here, we can just use num spawned. So that's good. That should mean now with our village, it doesn't spawn all of them in to begin with. So that's a good way of testing our game debugger is actually working in terms of picking up new entries and that list properly expands. We will also end up testing the removal as well. So empty to begin with. New villager gets added in. So we can see this is updating, and whichever one I've got selected, it properly remains with that one selected. So that's good. Now, if I go and let's delete villager 4, you can see they disappear from the list. What if I delete the one that I've currently got selected? So if I delete them, that handles it, and it goes back to showing just the first one there. So that's good. We have our debugger working now as both an editor window or as the in-game one. And I can close that editor window if I want. And then I can bring that back up at any point in time. And it's just working. So I can go and inspect the different ones, and all of that is just consistently working regardless. So that's really good. We've got our game debugger now supporting both options, our in-game UI and our editor window. In future, there's other things I do want to be adding to this. I want to start looking at giving options there for toggling subsections like the blackboard, like the output from the brain, and also controlling things like verbosity. So a bunch of additional things I do want to be adding there in future. But for the moment, we've now got that editor window all up and running. So dive on in and experiment with that. See any other things you might want to add to that yourself. Thanks, folks. Hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you are looking for the code for the project, the code for that is linked in the description below. You'll actually find 3 links in the description. One is to the code as it was at the start of the video, so if you're wanting to grab exactly that. The next is the code as it is now at the end of the video. And the final link is to the completed package that has all of this content in it. So all of that is there and available. You can freely use that in any of your own projects, commercial or non-commercial ones. If you have any questions, chuck those in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description as well. But until next time,